Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for thanks so much for joining us for this Q&A. We hope you enjoyed the panel, how to be anti-racist in the arts, and the launch of the Creative Equity Toolkit. So we've got Mikala Tai, Benjamin Law, Peter White, and myself, Lena Nahlous, online. Sonia Merman from Diversity Arts Australia is moderating, so she'll be collecting any questions that you have and sharing them with us and consolidating some of those questions. I might just also acknowledge that while the broadcast was filmed on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, I wanted to acknowledge that I live on the land of the Wongal of the Eora Nation and work on the land of the Barramadigal of the Darug. And I also wanted to ask a question, starting with Peter White, that I didn't get a chance to ask, which is what the place is of targets and you know what your position is, Peter, on in terms of having targets and quotas and diversity standards.
Yeah, so I'd just also like to, once more acknowledge Gadigal people, Gadigal country. I have the utmost privilege to live in and work on Gadigal lands, and are continually reminded about the strength of Gadigal people and their history and their current present tense and future as well in navigating through difficult times, as well as leading us the way in their custodianship of this amazing country in that we are privileged to be on. Now, targets. I guess my career being based on when it started back in 1990, going to university, getting my first roles, have been put through, I guess what you could call affirmative actions, those abilities. So I think they're really important and effective tools to be used. And one of the things that I always take with me, it's not a privilege in a sense to be able to have these tools. You actually, from my cultural sort of upbringing, the knowledge that it's actually an obligation that you take on, and particularly in the First Nation space, the champions and the warriors that we follow, who have carved out these opportunities. And I think in terms of that, just for individuals to embrace that, not that you have a great opportunity to forge an amazing career, or more privileged opportunities than our parents, our grandparents, and generations before had to struggle. I think it's keeping that front and centre of mind, and particularly for me personally, that's what grounds me. I go back to what my dad said early on in terms of how these opportunities, how these targets get placed, and he always said, you're only a token if you act like one. And I think that's an important lesson that's always carried with me. But I think in terms of that, it also comes with the challenges, and what we were talking about on the panel just previously. It's one thing to have opportunities and targets and that, but if the systems aren't in place to help support, it can have dire effects. And I think that's the other thing, that we hear issues of the need for more and more cultural safety, the toxicity of some workplaces, just whether it's from ignorance or the other offset of empathy is apathy, that people just are apathetic. So I think it's that self-awareness that needs to be, and actually have that thought of, is this the right place for a First Nations or a diverse migrant, a refugee? Always being aware, and that's what I was sort of saying, about empathy and that. So I'll leave it at that, because
no,
I want to hear from Mikala and Ben as well.
Yeah, Mikala and Ben, do you want to have a conversation about that as well?
I guess from my mind, I have a very kind of mixed, relationship with the idea of quotas, which I think we all do. It's not cut and dry, but I do want to make it really clear. I think when you are someone of a, culturally and linguistically diverse or ATSI background in a role in an organisation, your job extends past your job description to also be responsible to your community and people who have come before you and done all the work already, but also making more space for those that come behind. And Hilary Carter in the UK very clearly said to me last year, you have to turn around and put your hand out and make sure you bring a whole lot of other people with you once you get into any position in any organisation. So there is a lot of responsibility, I think, that comes with being of a diverse background in an organisation that's beyond just the scope of a job.
And I feel like in some ways I probably addressed this on the Opera House stage, which is, I don't think there's a panacea in terms of moving forward. Some people use quotas, some people use targets, some people use other forms of affirmative action. I guess maybe the uncomfortable thing I'd ask is a question, which is, if you look at your leadership team and you look at your workplace and it's predominantly white, or it's extremely monocultural, or it doesn't include people with disabilities, if there is a gap there, how did you get to that point? I think that's the question. Like, sometimes we're so focused on how do we recruit more diversity, as if it's this add-on, when it really should have been structurally and baked in there from the beginning. So what has prevented your organization from including people who are First Nations or migrant background or queer or have disabilities? And if you can't answer that question, one of the things that we often hear is that, well, we just hired on merit, which I think is a really problematic answer to give, because what you're saying there is, oh, well, just coincidentally, in a country where roughly a third of us aren't Anglo, merit is equated to predominantly white. So, you've got to be really careful about the arguments you put forward as well, because if you're not acknowledging the blind spots of how you actually got there, you're probably going to have difficulty coming up with a strategy to address it.
Thank you. That were really fantastic responses that kind of give us a lot to think about. I also have a question here from someone joining us on the Q&A about the kinds of support that there's available, that there might be available in this current environment that's really tough in the arts, to actually make their team more representative, like given the financial constraints under COVID, or those constraints, like how do organizations do this during this time? I actually think this time is quite exciting, because it gives us a chance to rebuild an arts sector and a screen sector that just desperately needs to have equity embedded into it. But this is a really good question that we get asked a lot. How do we do this given the constraints on our organisation? Who wants to answer that?
I guess, I'll start. If the question is about how do you make change within your organisation, is that kind of just the question, Lena?
Yeah, how do you do it in this current environment?
Most of this stuff doesn't take any cost, or shouldn't be any cost. It's really getting together with your organisation and making a strategic document that puts it at the heart of your organisation. And as Peter was saying before, that we were having a bit of a side chat before we started, putting budget against it, putting it in the core of your business to ensure that it remains part of how you talk about yourselves, how you ask for funding, and how you spend your money. If it's related to a budget line, then it actually is part of your day-to-day. It can't just sit as some kind of esoteric document on someone's server. It has to be something that is used by the organisation.
And I'd add to what Mikala's saying as well. Like, for instance, we've been having a lot of conversations in the arts about how do you prevent, like what we were talking about on the stage, how do you prevent all white judging panels awarding a prize, for instance? And so often what I've found is it often comes to someone who might actually be like a really great white ally, harvesting contacts. And it's like, who can be the judge for blah, blah, blah. And they work so hard to harvest all of this, you know, diverse talent out there that they previously hadn't have. But I don't think it's necessarily fair on that one ally to do all of the work when enshrined mechanisms can be put in place saying, hey, look, we're just going to put a rule in, similarly to how we think that all male panels aren't acceptable. We also think all white panels aren't going to be acceptable. And when you put that and enshrine it in policy, it means everyone needs to share the load at making sure that everyone else is included.
Do you have anything to add to that, Peter?
Oh, look, just quickly, you know, being part of recruitment and that over the years and that, I think one of the key things that you can actually really tap into this space is actually thinking a bit more deeply around your job descriptions, your advertisements, like even within New South Wales government or the federal government as well. There's things like capability frameworks, but nowhere is within these capability frameworks that, you know, essential criteria or skills that people are required are things like cultural intelligence, you know, self-awareness or the value. And I think this is the other thing of moving it in, yeah, the real value that diversity has and the diverse experiences and that can actually contribute to a workforce, an organisation. Even when you look at organisational capacity and work, you know, the cultural elements or workforce culture, very rarely you see within an organisation identifying a real benefit of diversity within their culture, or the, yeah, for our end, the First Nations value and First Nations worldview of what that could bring to your organisation. So I think even those stepping stones, I'll be interrogating the processes that you actually already have in place and saying, where does this fit within that? You know, because unless you have it there and that strong awareness, well, it's easy to overlook.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks all. That was a really good responses, and hopefully useful for those who asked about how to do that work organisationally. And just shamelessly plugging the Creative Equity Toolkit. There are some great resources for organisations who don't know where or how to start within their current kind of environment that might be able to assist you on that. In doing that work. We have a specific question for Benjamin Law, from an emerging producer screenwriter, asking how do emerging producers and screenwriters navigate through this time when we don't have the power and influence of more established screen professionals? So seeking advice for somebody who's in that space.
I think it's about finding your tribe and your champions. It's really difficult, right, when you are starting out and you can't necessarily see who those people are. But if you start joining the professional guilds that are out there, like the Australian Writers Guild, like the Australian Producers Guild, a lot of these relationships and networks in the arts are made through, you know, personal relationships as well. And that's really about trying to find the intel on what opportunities are out there. I know someone like Nikki Aiken, who's Asian Australian background, like myself and Mikala. She's a really terrific young screenwriter who champions a lot of people, and we sit on the diversity committee together at the guild, at the Writers Guild. And she's come up with the really terrific model of well, one, getting as many diverse note takers into rooms as possible, because that's such an amazing and useful entry point in terms of you getting a foothold into those rooms, you having face-to-face conversations with producers and screenwriters yourself. But the other thing that I've been really impressed by is the way in which Nikki's crafted policies in some projects where young and emerging screenwriters who have some credits under their belt will get first pass with writing a script, and then the established the screenwriter will take over the second and third draft or something like that. But there are all these models that are starting to emerge now. And I think the other thing is when you see there are projects that have been done that are kind of in your ballpark or kind of speak to your frequency, or you've seen that they've championed, you know, First Nations work, like Blackfella Films, for instance, or have a really great track record at doing diverse works, like say Matchbox Pictures with Tony Ayres and Debbie Lee, Rachel Perkins and Darren Dale over at Blackfella Films. You know, find who those people are and see if you can get advice from them, because, you know, that they're several steps ahead of us in terms of breaking through the industry, and they'll know maybe some people who that you might want to talk to, but also, you know, Screen Queensland and all the state funding bodies, the national funding bodies as well. They've got a lot of initiatives. If you're First Nations background, particularly, you know, AFTRS, Screen Australia, a lot of the state and territory funding bodies, they have specific Indigenous departments that will be able to support you. So there are lots of different mechanisms. There's not just one cure-all that I can recommend, but do your research.
Thanks. Thanks, Ben. I might direct this one to Mikala to start with. Do you have any advice for mid-career creatives who are navigating particular art forms where there's no visibility of creatives of colour? And it seems like there's very little accountability to address this issue. Do you have advice for how they can do that? Like how they can navigate those art forms where they don't see that there are any, you know, kind of people of colour in those art forms, and there doesn't seem to be a desire to shift that.
I think
that's what I think the question's asking anyway.
I think you don't have to stay within your art form. This is a bigger conversation than just the arts. So talking to people, whether it's within visual arts if you're in dance, or theatre if you're in whatever, I think there's a lot of things that can be drawn across art forms, but in sort of wider circumstances, and also out of the arts. Sometimes I think we just operate alone in this sort of very small bubble which we work within, that can become quite cyclical or self-reflexive. And if you actually engage with the wider conversation in organisations, maybe something from the Human Rights Watch, or aligned in value to what we're sort of doing, you might find a bit more guidance in that. And that's kind of a conceptual way. But if you're talking about practical things, if there's nothing there, be really noisy. There's no shame when there's a great need to sort of put our hands up and ask why. Ask for meetings with your funding body. Make this a really clear gap that people can't ignore. And by doing that, we are able to sort of fund identified positions and to actually push some influence on how policy is being created when there is a visible gap. But the gaps are only visible if we're noisy about it.
And does anybody else have anything to add to that, or should I keep moving through the questions? That was a really good response, Mikala. Maybe Peter, this might be a good question for you. Do you have any advice for junior staff approaching management with calls to take diversity seriously, especially when management staff are all white? That's a hard one. That's a hard position for people to find themselves in. You're on mute, Peter. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I just had the kiddies coming home from school. So, look, it is a really difficult place to be in. And just in my own personal experience and what I've seen, you know, in different sectors, the struggles that particularly our young First Nations people, you know, in the museum sector and the gallery sector, and in actually addressing these things and the need. Look, I think my only suggestion is, and we do it sort of ad hocly anyway, it goes back to that old thing of strength in numbers. And I think these are the comings together of staff networks, broader sector networks, doing not necessarily to enhance your voice, but to amplify it and actually have that protection base by your peers. And getting the balance of not only your peers, but the right type of cultural mentorship that can support you in that. and you know, to build in your own safety mechanisms, I think is the critical thing, because I think deep down, you know, what we all sort of have experience in that, you know, oh, do I want to raise this, or is that career suicide for me? And I think that's evident of, you know, there is no solution at the moment, because you look at most workforces and even within government, you know, the issues around bullying behaviour and so forth is still prevalent there, and there is no golden answer. But I think it's to, you know, gain that strength within your own cohorts and foster and that notion of being able to carve out space and time to support each other, and, you know, instead of one person going up, a group of people, or that is actually a more beneficial to not only the message being heard, but the security that you have in that safety. And I think from my end, the individual safety and looking after that person in itself, you know, is of real importance. You're on mute now, Lena.
Does anybody else want? I thought that was a really, really good response, and it is really difficult being in that position, and the importance of kind of allyship is so key. And that's why we need really good structures, so that there are these processes that don't put all the weight on individuals. Mikala or Benjamin, did you want to add anything to that from your own experiences, or are you?
I'm fine.
Yeah, Peter covered it well, but happy to take the next question.
Okay, we have lots here, by the way. This is a fun one. How do we urge people to step aside in organisations to create space for people of colour and First Nations people?
Urge is a great word.
I'll give you the hard one. Who wants the hard one?
I mean, there's a part of me that wonders whether the conversation is about stepping aside so much as it is about sharing. Do you know what I mean? Like this idea that, you know, people need to necessarily lose in order for other people to step up, I think is kind of a false dichotomy. And look, I might be wrong, but my instinct is, I mean, there's that old saying, right? Like when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I feel like that kind of assumption that other people being raised up will necessarily cost you, I don't necessarily see that happening when diversity and inclusion is baked into the workplace. I see ideas being shared. I feel like more discussion and debate and knowledge is brought to the table when you bring more people to the table. Do you know what I mean? So maybe this is like, I don't know, old school socialist, you know, cap kind of talking at the moment, but I'm not actually convinced that people are going to lose out. We're asking you to share the space. That's all.
I think building on that, Ben, I think maybe one sort of rule of thumb is when you are hiring, you just don't hire a version of yourself, because you don't have a conversation with yourself in the office. You want to have debate, and that if that doesn't come from the heart of an arts organisation, how can your work be really pushing and developing things further? So if you can always hire someone that isn't like you, then you're already starting to build a workplace that has that built in, and that goes for all of us.
And
yeah, I'll just jump in and yeah, what I was saying on the panel, I think yeah, and this is a really simplistic view as well. That notion of that, you know, resilience and surviving, and you know, it's very difficult in these times. But you know, expanding that and growth and prosperity, and you know, as I said, it's very simplistic when we're in the midst of COVID and you know, how we build our sector and that. But I think if we're just protecting our own patch, And we've had this experience in First Nations. It's so many, whether positions are being funded or through affirmative actions and these quotas and targets, but there's this element of we wanted to get a First Nations person, but we couldn't find one or attract it. Number one, I'll just on and off. I always say, have you asked that no one may not want to work for you, because you might, that's an important thing. But I think on the other, I've always been a strong, well, if you do need to fill it with someone that has a strong First Nations aspect in it, you only do it for a period of time, and try and explore that you actually might bring someone else in at a more junior level and grow your own, because you're still sharing those. I think there's different ways to actually look at it instead of, we're attempting this, it's too difficult, so we'll just keep on doing what we've always done.
Can I just step in here, because I just saw in the comments Claudia Rusin say a really good point and a good caveat to all of this, which is sometimes people do truly need to step aside. If they're doing damage and not learning or growing, how then do we urge them to step aside? And there are a few things that really spark something for me, because if they're doing damage, then they probably, and if they're not going to learn, they do need to get out. And I think that's even less from a diversity issue. That's more from a just toxicity and maybe incompetence issue. And sometimes, if you do have allies, there are ways to start coups within an organization to drive people out who need to be driven out. And I think the other thing as well is, and sometimes actually some people do need to step aside in order to accommodate people. So it's not just the whole sharey paradigm I was talking about before. And I know from my perspective, something that I've learned is, there have been some conversations that I've moderated or have been asked to be the interviewee of. And I'm like, well, as much as these are conversations about diversity, what I've also learned in talking to my Black friends, whether they're First Nations or African diaspora friends, is actually maybe you should pass the mic to someone else. Like, you might feel equipped to, but if there are only so many slots, maybe it's time to share that platform. And recently, I was approached to be on a project that was focusing on gender diversity. And I'm like, look, I'm a part of the broader queer community, but I'm a cisgender dude. And I've written about transgender issues in my journalism, but I'm still a cisgender dude. And if it's coming from lived experience, all that sort of stuff, here's a whole lot of gender diverse people that I know who have rungs on the board. Here are 7 of them. Go for your life, and sometimes you really need to do that too, from self-awareness.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think sometimes people kind of can treat other people of colour like I feel like sometimes I'm a priest, and people come to me and say, oh, I don't, I'm a white person in this position of power, and whatever, and I kind of feel like it is that thing when they're a good person and that they're an ally. I'll say to them, well, why aren't you sharing that power and mentoring and supporting somebody if you don't think that, so that they can then be stepping into that role in the future or working alongside you? Or so these are really great conversations, and definitely conversations that the toolkit also touches on. And we have little kind of quizzes in there for organizations also to kind of be able to reflect on themselves and their practices and their employment practices. And we've got a whole employment section that isn't up yet, but will be up shortly. I've got like so many great questions here, and I'm conscious of time. And I know that Benjamin, you probably need to leave am I right, in a little
That's
bit?
okay. I'll be here for the rest of the Q&A.
Okay. There's a really good one here, which is, when will we as a society begin to move beyond language that focuses on labels like CALD around identity to that of needs of a community individual? This is a thesis topic. Who wants to, do you understand the question? Did I, so how do we move beyond your labels?
Well, I think the labels are as important as we need them. Do you know what I mean? Like, we've only got those labels because we need to talk about cultural and linguistic diversity because it's so lacking in our workplaces. We have it in our communities, we have it in our neighborhoods. But I also take your point that, you know, there's a reason why we use CALD in Australia, they use BAME in the UK, BIPOC in the United States, and when you try to transfer them, it gets tricky and a little bit not quite right. But you know, like, I don't go around introducing myself as a CALD person, you know, but at the same time, I don't feel like that being counted as a culturally and linguistically diverse background person erases all of the other individual stuff that I have going on. You know, I think we need to be specific in our language, and I think sometimes when we are talking about diversity, these labels are unfortunately just necessary, especially when it comes to administrative dialogue and bureaucracy.
And I think the term diversity, I mean, I have many problems with the word diversity, as I do with most sort of categorizations. But what people really mean when they say diversity is they mean reality. They need to reflect what's the reality of what's happening on our streets, in our country, on our stages, in our theatres, in our galleries. That's what diversity means. It actually means reality. So we're still in that slippage moment and pushing towards, we don't need to use these labels anymore. I don't know when that will happen, some mystical place in the future when, you know, the place that I work for, I mean, 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art, well, maybe we won't need to have a place like us in the future because it will just be threaded through everything. But for this moment, it is our biggest way to mark what we do. In some ways, is to work with the label. But it is a love-hate relationship.
Have anything to add to that, Peter?
Oh, look, you know, it's a very different perspective for First Nations people, of course, but even within that, you know, labelling, you know, even within the panel, you know, I use you know, you probably saw me, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations, and you know, me personally, you know, I'm a Gummeroo Murray. That's my identity. That's who I am. I do know, and I've asked people in you know, would you prefer to be Aboriginal? You know, there is diversity within that people's experiences and what they want to actually identify with, and that's really important. But I think in that, yeah, as I touched on in the panel, the uniqueness of First Nations people in this country, and the importance of actually understanding that, and when I say understand, really understanding what that means, not you know, a ticker box acknowledgement and then we move on, and that value base that we have, I think is really important, and we always will be, you know, have that standing. And I agree, but there's also the importance for us to also have our own spaces to practice who we are and what we are, and actually navigate of where we're going in the future, which is unique, you know, even to me as a Gamilaroi diaspora living in Gadigal lands, and how I connect back with country and my boys back to country, and also my community up there. And we need our own special places, and I think that's an equal valid and also a critical importance as well.
This is a really like I feel like a much longer conversation. So many good questions here. And sorry that I'm not necessarily going to get to them all. I've got another one which is about how you tread the line between action and virtue signalling in organisations that always need to show outward-facing progress. There's definitely a competition between arts organisation about who's doing the best at diversity. Have you experienced your work and efforts being exploited for the sake of making an organisation look better? Well, I certainly have, but really keen to hear from the panel.
Look, I think I have many cases where we're a very clear organisation that people want to align with for many reasons, and you know, it is a very complex situation to be in. And I think in many times, I mean, the basis of how we work at 4A, and I think in our, what we spoke about briefly on the Opera House, is the fact that we have always, as, you know, migrants, we're a migrant organisation, we have looked towards what has been done beforehand and been led by First Nations. I mean, undeniably that conversation has to happen first, and our conversation second. And as part of that, it's been sort of working with the huge amount of work that has been done ahead of us to try and figure out what the next steps are and how things can be done to the core and foundation of how we are built, as opposed to things that are done to tick those boxes in reporting or acquittals. It's really not about that at all. And I can see how for many organisations of which these kinds of issues don't sort of part of their everyday conversation in the organisation can become just something that they think about when they're doing an acquittal. But it's about really broadening that conversation at all times.
And we also kind of have a question about, or a comment really from somebody talking about how we seem to be conflating First Nations issues and people of colour issues, and to kind of acknowledge that for those of us who are migrant settlers, that, you know, to address our own privilege and ways that we can be complicit in upholding systems of oppression. I think that's to me, that's a comment, and I think that is something that we do acknowledge at, you know, Diversity Arts, and that was something I said in the talk about us being, you know, migrant settlers on this land, and it's definitely in the toolkit as well, to acknowledge that.
And I think that also reflects, Lena, that, you know, the limits of, you know, even if we're going to talk about called people, like that's not a monolith. Asian Australian is not a monolith. You know, even First Nations isn't a monolith. Obviously, like look at how many First Nations are actually constitute this continent. And I think, you know, as much as we talk about culturally and linguistically diverse populations, like there are going to be a very specific set of issues that Arab Australians face versus Asian Australians. And even within Asian Australians, there's going to be Southeast and East Asian diaspora conversation that's slightly different to the South Asian diaspora narrative as well, which is why we've all got to acknowledge that, you know, each of us probably have a set of advantages and disadvantages, privileges and non, when it comes to having these conversations. And I think that's a really, really important point to raise. You can't erase those differences if we're going to talk about diversity.
Yeah, and also all that intersectionality to kind of talk about our relative class privileges or lack of, or, you know, how people kind of came to Australia, whether it was as a refugee or whether it was, you know, a kind of a wealthy kind of migrant. But there's so, yeah, I mean, I'm totally agreeing with you. There's so much diversity within diversity, and it is something that we try to be kind of always conscious of in the way that we work at Diversity Arts anyway. And it's certainly something I'm, you know, thinking about all the time. Like I can't represent all Arab voices at all, you know, so much diversity. And I'm not here to represent the Arab voice because it's not static. I think sometimes we use terms like people of colour or culturally diverse, or you know, as also as a way of resisting, because this is terminology. It quite often, you know, if we're not allowed to say the thing that we know to be true, which is there's a lack of representation, and we're not allowed to kind of you know, speak back, you know, we need that kind of terminology, and we need also that kind of collectivism, because quite often culturally diverse people, for example, with our leadership report, we found that there was a total, you know, underrepresentation in every area of the arts of people from non-Anglo, non-Celtic kind of backgrounds. So so do you want me to, maybe I'll need to kind of wrap up. I feel like there's quite a few more questions, but how's the panel feeling? Do you think you can go one more, or shall we?
Oh, look, I think I'd like to, you know, obviously there's lots of questions there, and, you know, to take that offline and have a bit of a you know, a think about it and answer those. But, you know, I for me personally, I think yeah, the attendees just on this Q&A and the conversations that's happening, you know, the need to keep this conversation going, and you know, it's all part of it. So you know, I think the importance of, and this is the thing of the toolkit, you know, the mechanisms and the tools that we can come together and continue these conversations and share that dialogue and that. So I'm happy to answer more questions, or, you know, either way. So
I think Benjamin has an interview
yeah.
now,
That's okay.
so I might wrap it. Thank you so much, Peter. I agree with you. We need to, and thank you all of you listening today for contributing those questions. Like Peter said, we'll keep these conversations going. It was our intention before COVID at Diversity Arts to have one of these kinds of discussions as we rolled out each section or every few sections of the toolkit. So we'll be having more of these conversations, and you know, these are always learning moments for all of us. So thank you for joining us. Check out creativeequitytoolkit.org. Thank you so much to our amazing panel. I can hear your virtual applause. Peter White, Mikala Tai, Benjamin Law, and to Sydney Opera House, British Council, our partner in this, Create New South Wales and Creative Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks everyone for being here with us.
And before you all log off, you'll get a pop-up with a survey link. It's a diversity arts survey. So if you have any feedback to give us, you can provide it there. Thank you.
We love it. We're always learning. Thank you.